The day Judy Fenwick showed up at my front door in the middle of a blizzard, clipboard in hand, wearing a puffy orange coat that made her look like a traffic cone with authority issues, I knew things were about to get interesting. She had that look on her face, the one where her lips press together so tight they practically disappear, and her eyes go all squinty like she's trying to read fine print from 20 feet away. I'd seen that look before. It usually meant she'd found something new to be miserable about. And this time, she'd driven through 8 inches of fresh snow just to deliver the misery personally. That kind of dedication, honestly, you have to respect it a little, even when it's completely infuriating. My name is Tom Baker, and I've lived at the edge of Pinecrest Hollow for going on 11 years now. My property sits on about 40 acres of wooded land at the back end of the development, which is one of the main reasons I bought it. The other main reason was the registered snowmobile trail that runs right through it. Before I ever signed a single piece of paperwork, before I shook a single hand, before the ink dried on anything, I researched that trail. I knew it was there. I knew what it was registered as. I knew exactly what my rights were as the landowner. And I bought the property specifically because I wanted that trail. Winter is my season. Snowmobiling is my thing. I've got a garage full of machines and a heart full of enthusiasm for exactly this kind of frozen wilderness living. So when Judy Fenwick stood on my porch in the middle of a nor'easter, waving a piece of paper at me like she was flagging down a helicopter, my first reaction was curiosity. My second reaction, once I read the paper, was a very slow, very deliberate blink. The paper was an HOA notice. It stated, in the kind of officious language that people who feel important love to use, that the Pinecrest Hollow Homeowners Association had passed a new resolution banning the operation of snowmobiles within the community and on any land parcel registered within the HOA boundary. Effective immediately. Fine of up to $500 per incident. Signed by Judy Fenwick, HOA president, in handwriting so aggressive it had practically stabbed through the paper. I looked at the paper. I looked at Judy. I looked back at the paper. "Judy," I said, and my voice was very calm because I'd had 11 years to develop patience when it came to this woman. "My snowmobile trail is registered with the state. It's a designated recreational trail. It's listed in the county land records. It predates this HOA by about 6 years. Judy lifted her chin. "The HOA's governing documents apply to all parcels within the boundary, Tom. It doesn't matter what was registered before. The community has spoken." "Did the community include me in that vote?" I asked. "The meeting was properly noticed," she said, which was exactly the kind of answer that doesn't actually answer the question you asked. I took the paper. I said thank you, which I think genuinely surprised her. I watched her navigate carefully back to her SUV through the snow, which she was not great at in those little boots, and then I closed my front door and stood there in my warm kitchen with the smell of coffee in the air, and about 40 acres of fury building quietly in my chest. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a difficult person. My neighbors will tell you that. I bring people firewood when their heating situation gets rough in January. I plow out the end of the cul-de-sac with my own truck when the county plow misses it, which is every single snowstorm. I've lent tools, shoveled walks for people who were out of town, and brought hot chili to the Hendersons when their furnace went out last February and they were stuck with space heaters for 3 days. I do not go looking for trouble, but when trouble shows up on my doorstep in an orange puffer coat, I am absolutely prepared to respond to it. The thing about the snowmobile trail is that it's not just mine, and that's where Judy made her first major miscalculation. The trail, officially registered as Pinecrest Recreational Corridor Trail Number 7, with the state's Department of Natural Resources, runs roughly 4 miles through the back end of this whole area. It enters my property from the state forest land to the north, cuts through my 40 acres, and then exits across an easement at the south end where it connects to more state land. The trail has been groomed and maintained by a local snowmobile club for decades. Families use it. Local kids use it. People who live 6 miles away trailer their machines to the state forest access point and ride through. It's not just my hobby, it's a genuine community asset for the winter recreation folks in this whole region. Judy's little notice wasn't just telling me to park my snowmobiles. She was, whether she understood it or not, attempting to block a registered public recreational corridor from functioning. And she was doing it based on an HOA resolution that I had not been notified about in advance, had not been given the opportunity to vote on, and that I was fairly confident had zero legal authority over state-registered trail easements in the first place. I poured myself that coffee and I called my buddy Dave Kowalski, who is a property rights attorney and also happens to own a snowmobile of his own, so he understood the situation from multiple angles simultaneously. "Send me the notice," Dave said. I sent it. There was a short pause and then a sound from Dave that I can only describe as the noise a person makes when they read something that's both legally problematic and deeply entertaining. "Tom," Dave said, "she can't do this." "I know she can't do this," I said. "Tell me exactly why she can't do this." Dave walked me through it. State-registered recreational trail easements operate under state law and are governed by the DNR, not by private homeowner associations. The HOA's authority extends to things like paint colors, fence heights, whether you can park a boat trailer in your driveway. It does not, in any universe, extend to overriding a state-registered easement recorded in the county deed records. Beyond that, the easement was recorded as a condition of the trail's registration, which means it runs with the land. You can't just vote it away at a Tuesday night HOA meeting. Dave also pointed out, with some relish, that Judy's notice had threatened fines for operating snowmobiles on land that was explicitly covered by a state easement, and that applying private fines to restrict access to a registered public recreational corridor had some genuinely interesting legal implications. I thanked Dave and told him I'd keep him posted. Then I put on my Carhartt jacket and my good insulated boots, and I went out to look at my land. The snow was still coming down, big fat flakes, the kind of snow that looks like someone is emptying a feather factory directly onto northern Vermont. My 40 acres stretched out white and quiet and beautiful, the pine trees absolutely loaded with snow, the trail running clear and wide through the middle of it like a white road through a postcard. I'd groomed it 2 days ago with the trail groomer I share with the snowmobile club. It was perfect. Machine smooth, packed firm, ready for riding, and Judy Fenwick wanted to ban snowmobiles on it. I stood there in the cold for a while, watching the snow fall, and I thought about my options. I could fight the HOA directly, go to the meetings, argue the legal point, wait for them to maybe come around. That was one option. Or I could take a slightly more direct approach, one that would make the situation absolutely clear to everyone involved, and that would do it in a way that was completely legal, completely within my rights, and also, if I'm being honest, a little bit satisfying. I decided to post no trespassing signs along every acre of my property. Now, I want to explain why this matters, because it's not just stubbornness. My property is bordered on 3 sides by other HOA parcels. The trail, obviously, runs through it and brings snowmobile traffic. But there's something else that my property provides, something that I'd never made a big deal about because I'm not a difficult person. There are paths and shortcuts across my land that various neighbors use. There's a path that the Garrison family uses to walk to the pond in winter for ice skating. There's a track across the south field that people cut through on cross-country skis. There's even a little informal parking area that snowmobilers use at the north end of my property when they're accessing the trail from the road. None of these people have formal permission. They've just been doing it because I'm a decent guy and I've never minded, until Judy decided to mind on my behalf. If the HOA wanted to make decisions about what activities were permitted on my land, Then my land was going to become a lot less available to the community that the HOA claimed to represent. I ordered 100 no trespassing signs online that night, express shipping, and while I was waiting for them I called Greg Sanner, who runs the local snowmobile club, and told him what was happening. Greg's response was immediate and not suitable for reproduction in polite company, but the cleaned-up version is that he was very interested in the situation and would be making some phone calls himself. The signs arrived in 2 days, which felt like a gift from the universe, because by that point the snow had settled and it was a clear, crisp, absolutely gorgeous winter morning. My neighbor Phil Deacon came over with his post driver, which is a tool designed for exactly this kind of work, and we spent the better part of a morning driving posts and hanging signs along every boundary of my 40 acres. 1 per acre, as promised. Bright orange, hard to miss, professionally printed, completely legal. I didn't say a word to anyone else about it. I didn't post on social media. I didn't send any notices. I just put up the signs and waited. It didn't take long. The Garrison kids showed up at the south end of my property 2 days later, skates in hand, heading for their usual cut-through to the pond path. They found a no trespassing sign and came to my door, genuinely confused, because they'd been doing this for years and I'd always been fine with it. I explained the situation to them calmly. I told them I wasn't angry at them, that they were welcome people and always had been, but that the HOA had decided to regulate what happened on my property, and since that was apparently the new situation, I needed to make sure my boundaries were clearly established. I suggested they walk around the roadside to get to the pond access, which added about 12 minutes to their trip. They looked confused and a little disappointed, and I felt bad about that part, genuinely. But I explained that if they wanted to talk to the HOA about getting the snowmobile ban reversed, I'd be very happy to let them use the path again. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, I'd had 6 separate conversations with neighbors who'd encountered my signs and wanted to know what was going on. Each time, I told the story calmly and completely. I didn't editorialize. I didn't exaggerate. I just laid out the facts. The HOA had passed a resolution banning snowmobiles on my registered trail, and I'd responded by securing the boundaries of my private property. The reaction was interesting. A couple of people initially seemed to think I was being unreasonable. But when I showed them the HOA notice, and when I explained what the registered trail actually was and what authority the HOA actually had over it, the mood shifted pretty quickly. Meanwhile, Greg Sanner had not been idle. He'd contacted the state DNR about the situation because the HOA's notice was technically attempting to block access to a registered recreational trail, which is not a small thing. The DNR assigned someone to look into it. Greg also posted about it in the regional snowmobile club network, which is a surprisingly well-connected community, and within a week, there were about 40 people in the loop who were paying attention to what Judy Fenwick and the Pinecrest Hollow HOA had decided to do. The first HOA meeting after I'd posted the signs was something I genuinely looked forward to attending. The meeting was held in the community center, which is a small building that the HOA maintains and which is kept at approximately the temperature of a meat locker, because apparently the HOA also has opinions about what constitutes a comfortable thermostat setting in winter. I showed up in my good flannel shirt and jeans, carrying a folder of documents, and I sat down in the front row. There were about 20 other residents there, which was a higher turnout than usual. I recognized several people who had encountered my no trespassing signs and wanted answers. Judy Fenwick ran the meeting from behind a folding table at the front of the room. She was wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my snowmobile groomer attachment, and she had the particular expression of someone who knows a confrontation is coming and has decided to look as official as possible to compensate. She got through the agenda items with efficient speed, saving the snowmobile resolution for near the end, which was her way of trying to present it as a settled matter rather than an ongoing debate. When she got to it, she described it in the most positive possible terms, something about community safety and noise concerns and protecting the neighborhood character. And I noticed she didn't mention anything about the state registration or the easement or the DNR's interest in the situation. I raised my hand. Judy looked at me with the expression of someone who had hoped very much that I would have quietly moved away or developed amnesia between now and this moment. "Tom," she said, in the tone of someone agreeing to let a small child ask a question they expect to answer dismissively. I stood up. I opened my folder. I put 3 documents on the table in front of her: the state trail registration, the easement language from the county deed records, and a letter from Dave Kowalski summarizing the relevant law. "Judy," I said, "I want to make sure everyone here understands what this resolution actually attempts to do. This trail is registered with the state DNR as a public recreational corridor. The easement is recorded in the county deed records. A homeowners association does not have the legal authority to ban activity on a state-registered easement. It's not a gray area. Dave Kowalski, who is a property rights attorney, has reviewed the notice you gave me and has provided this summary, which I'm happy to share with the board and with everyone here tonight." I handed copies to the board members, which was Judy and 2 other people who generally did whatever Judy said, and I also handed copies to a few of the other residents. There was some silence. One of the board members, a quiet guy named Harold, read through the letter with an expression that went from neutral to increasingly uncomfortable. "Judy," Harold said, "did you know about the state registration before you drafted this resolution?" Judy's chin went up. "HOA's governing documents apply within the boundary regardless of state registrations." "That's not what this letter says," Harold said. "The letter was written by someone hired by a homeowner with a clear interest in the outcome," Judy said, dismissing Dave's credentials with a wave of her hand. "He's right, though," said another board member, a woman named Patricia who I had always liked and who was reading the easement language carefully. "This easement is in the deed records. It runs with the land. We can't override this with an HOA resolution. This is a legal document recorded at the county level." Judy's expression cycled through a few emotions quickly. She landed on determination. "We can seek our own legal counsel," she said firmly. "I'd recommend you do exactly that," I said, "because the DNR has also been notified about this situation, and I expect you'll be hearing from them separately." That landed with a very satisfying thud. A couple of people in the audience made quiet noises that were not in Judy's favor. The meeting ended without any resolution being taken on the snowmobile ban. Judy said the board would consult with their HOA attorney and revisit the matter. I said I'd be happy to hear the results of that consultation and suggested she send it to me in writing. I drove home in the cold dark, the road icy and the stars brilliant overhead the way they get in Vermont in deep winter when the air is dry and there's no cloud cover, and I felt pretty good about how that had gone. But I also knew Judy Fenwick well enough to know that she didn't let things go. She pivoted. She found new angles. She kept pushing until something worked or until the thing she was pushing against finally pushed back hard enough to stop her. I was right to keep my guard up, because 3 days later things got significantly more complicated. My neighbor across the road, a retired couple named the Flemings, came over looking distressed. Margaret Fleming had received a letter from the HOA citing her for having an unsightly accumulation of snow on her driveway, which would have been almost funny except that Margaret is 73 years old and her husband Frank has a bad back, and they'd had a hard time keeping up with the shoveling after the last storm. The fine threatened in the letter was $250. The letter was signed by Judy Fenwick. This was Judy's move. She couldn't get to me directly, at least not without a court fight she'd lose, so she was starting to apply pressure to the people around me, people who might not have documents and attorneys lined up and 40 acres of leverage. I took a look at Margaret's driveway, which honestly looked fine to me, nothing approaching a code violation, and I went home and got my snow blower. I spent an hour and a half clearing their driveway and the walkway and the steps, making it absolutely immaculate. Then I photographed it thoroughly, timestamped the photos, and sent a note to the HOA informing them that the cited property was now in full compliance and requesting they confirm in writing that the fine was withdrawn. I also pulled out the HOA's governing documents, which I had obtained some months earlier when Judy had tried a different maneuver about fence heights. In those documents, there was a specific process for issuing violation notices. It required photographic evidence of the violation, taken at the time of the notice. The letter to the Flemings had no photos attached. It didn't even specify what section of the code was being violated, which was another requirement. I fired off a letter to the HOA board, citing the specific procedural failures in the Fleming notice and requesting confirmation that the notice was void for procedural defects. Patricia, the board member who'd spoken up at the meeting, responded within 2 days saying the notice had been reviewed and was being withdrawn due to procedural issues. She worded it diplomatically, but the message was clear. Judy had jumped the gun and hadn't followed the HOA's own rules. Judy, predictably, did not take this quietly. I found out from Phil Deacon, who has a talent for knowing things, that Judy had called a special meeting of the HOA board, just the 3 board members, to discuss what she called non-compliant homeowners. Phil had heard this from Harold, who had called Phil to express his own growing discomfort with the direction things were going. Harold, it turned out, had not been fully on board with the snowmobile ban from the start. He'd been pressured into going along with it, and the meeting with Dave's letter had given him serious second thoughts. The other piece of information Phil passed along was more interesting and more troubling. Apparently, Judy had told the special meeting that she had contacted the HOA's property management company about whether there was any mechanism to place a lien on my property related to the snowmobile issue. She was looking for a financial weapon since the legal one had fallen apart. A lien on my property, based on a resolution that had no legal authority over the activity it was trying to ban. I called Dave again. Dave went quiet for a moment, then said very clearly that if Judy attempted to place an improper lien on my property, she would be exposing herself and the HOA to a claim for damages, legal fees, and potentially a bad faith abusive process. He also said that depending on how she pursued it, it could cross the line into something the court would not look kindly on. He told me to document everything and stay ready. I started keeping a detailed log. Every communication, every date, every conversation I could remember. I also set up a small security camera on the post at the end of my driveway, angled to capture anyone who came to my door or left anything in my mailbox. This was perfectly legal in Vermont, on my own property, covering my own driveway. Then the heating situation happened, and it changed everything. Vermont in late January is not forgiving. We'd had a cold snap that drove temperatures to -15 at night, and the whole community was dealing with the kind of strain on heating systems that you don't get in warmer winters. 3 houses on the south end of the development had propane deliveries delayed because the road into the back section was iced up and the propane truck couldn't safely navigate it. This is a real problem. Propane is the primary heat source for most of the houses out this way, and when it runs out in -15 weather, you are in genuine trouble. The solution, the one that had been used in past winters when this exact problem came up, was that propane trucks could come in from the north end by cutting through the access road that crossed the edge of my property. It was an informal arrangement, one I'd always been happy to support because, honestly, people's heat is not something to mess around with. The access road ran through the section of my property that now had no trespassing signs on it. Greg Sanner called me about the propane situation. He knew about it because one of the affected homeowners, the Carvers, were friends of his and had reached out in a mild panic about their propane level. I thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then I called the propane company and told them I would provide a written temporary access authorization for their truck to use the North Access Road for heating fuel deliveries for the rest of the winter. I also told Greg, and Greg told the Carvers, and I made absolutely sure that everyone understood that I was personally providing this authorization because I cared about my neighbors' well-being. I was equally clear about who was not providing it. The HOA had nothing to do with this access. The HOA's recent attempts to regulate my property had, in fact, motivated me to post no trespassing signs that had complicated this situation in the first place. I wasn't making a big, loud announcement about this, but I made sure the information was available to anyone who asked. The Carvers, who I'd met exactly twice before this, came to my house personally to thank me. Corinne Carver was a very nice woman in her late 50s who looked like she'd had a genuinely stressful couple of days, and she brought me a loaf of banana bread that I still think about sometimes. Her husband Rob shook my hand in the driveway in the cold and said he'd heard about what was going on with the HOA and the trail, and that it was ridiculous, and that Judy Fenwick needed to find a hobby. She has one, I told him. Unfortunately, it's ruining other people's hobbies. Rob said he'd be at the next HOA meeting. As it turned out, so would a lot of people. The propane story got around, the way things do in a small community where everyone talks to everyone else during a cold snap, because there's not much else to do when it's -15 and you're waiting for the propane truck. And the way it got around included the detail that I had voluntarily provided access for heating deliveries, even while the HOA was trying to penalize me for using my own registered trail. The contrast was not lost on anyone. Greg, who had continued working his channels with the Snowmobile Club network, had also organized something I hadn't expected. He told me about a week after the propane situation that the regional club had decided to hold their midwinter poker run on trail number 7, my trail, as a show of support and also as a legal demonstration of the trail's continued registered status. A poker run is a snowmobile event where riders visit a series of checkpoints, draw a playing card at each one, and the best poker hand at the end wins a prize. They're social events, typically 50 to 100 riders, loud and fun and festive in the way that winter in northern Vermont can be when people actually lean into it instead of hiding from it. Greg asked if I'd be willing to host the starting checkpoint at my property. I said I would be absolutely delighted. I then went back to my security camera footage for the past week, because I'd noticed my mailbox had been opened a couple of times on days when I hadn't gotten any regular mail, and I wanted to see who'd been there. What I found on the footage made me sit very still in front of my laptop for a long minute. Judy Fenwick had been to my property 3 times in the past week. Twice she'd stopped her SUV at the end of my driveway, taken photographs of my house and the surrounding land, and driven away. The 3rd time she had walked up to my mailbox, opened it, looked inside, and then put something in it before leaving. I went to the mailbox. I found a notice that had been placed there by hand, not mailed, no postage, no postmark. It was another HOA notice, this one citing me for a violation related to unauthorized commercial activity on my residential property. The basis for the citation was the temporary access agreement I'd given the propane company, which Judy was characterizing as me operating a commercial access easement without HOA approval. I read this sitting in my cold truck in my driveway, and I had a moment where I genuinely had to laugh, because the creativity was impressive even if the legal theory was completely unhinged. I went inside, made coffee, and called Dave. Dave did not laugh. Dave said this was actually getting into territory that was worth taking more seriously. Placing a notice in my mailbox without postage is, he mentioned, technically a federal violation, because private use of mailboxes is regulated by postal rules. Beyond that, the substance of the notice was frivolous on its face, and if Judy was personally attending my property to conduct what amounted to surveillance, and then delivering fabricated violation notices. That pattern of behavior was worth documenting carefully. I sent Dave the security camera footage from all 3 visits. He said to keep it somewhere safe and send him copies. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and in the meantime, the poker run was happening, and I had a starring role to play. The Saturday of the poker run was one of those winter days that makes you forget any complaints you might have had about winter. Clear blue sky, temperature around 12 degrees, which is cold but not brutal, the snow absolutely immaculate and sparkling. I'd set up a folding table with hot chocolate and coffee at my north gate, where a checkpoint official from the club was stationed with the card deck. Riders came through in groups, engines rumbling and exhaust pluming in the cold air, helmets and bright snowmobile suits, people laughing and taking photos. At peak checkpoint time, there were probably 30 snowmobiles staged on my property in a neat line, engines off, riders drinking hot chocolate and chatting. I had neighbors standing at the edge of the field watching, a couple of them with their kids who were absolutely fascinated by the machines. The Flemings came out in their heavy coats, and Margaret said it was the most fun thing she'd seen in this neighborhood in years. I don't know exactly when Judy Fenwick showed up. Phil spotted her first, sitting in her SUV at the road entrance to my property, which was marked with a No Trespassing sign, watching the whole thing from outside my boundary. She was there for about 20 minutes, and I can only imagine what she was thinking. There was nothing she could do. This was my land. These people had my permission. The trail was registered with the state. Every single thing happening on my property was completely legal. Phil took a photo of Judy's SUV sitting there watching. I filed it with my documentation log. The poker run raised money for trail maintenance across the whole regional system and was written up in the local Snowmobile Club newsletter as a great success. Trail number 7 was specifically mentioned as one of the best-conditioned sections of the whole regional network. My name was in the article as a cooperative landowner and trail host. I printed a copy and kept it. The next HOA meeting had a larger crowd than any I'd attended in 11 years of living here. I counted 31 residents, in a room that usually saw 12 on a good night. Folding chairs had been pulled out of the storage closet, and the temperature of the community center was finally set to something approaching human habitable, which I suspected was because someone other than Judy had adjusted the thermostat before the meeting. Harold opened the meeting, which was itself unusual. He normally let Judy lead. The fact that he'd taken the chair was meaningful. Judy was sitting at the board table in her blazer, her clipboard in front of her, but her posture was different than usual. Not as expansive. A little compressed, if that makes sense. Like a person who knows the wind has changed direction, but hasn't decided how to respond to it yet. Harold stated that the board had received the results of the HOA attorney's review of the snowmobile trail situation, and that he wanted to share them with the community. He read the relevant portion of the attorney's opinion aloud. It confirmed what Dave had said. The state trail registration and the easement in the county deed records were not subject to HOA governance. The resolution purporting to ban snowmobiles on trail number 7 was legally unenforceable as applied to that registered corridor. The attorney recommended the board rescind the resolution to avoid potential legal liability. There was a murmur in the room. Harold then said the board was voting to rescind the snowmobile resolution and asked for the vote. He voted yes. Patricia voted yes. Judy said nothing for a moment, then said no. The resolution was rescinded 2-1. I kept my expression neutral. Inside, it felt pretty good. Then I raised my hand because we weren't done. Harold, I said, while I appreciate the board acting on the attorney's recommendation, I also need to bring a few other matters to the community's attention. I stood up and laid out the sequence of events clearly and without drama. The Fleming notice, which had been procedurally defective and withdrawn. The mailbox notice about the propane access, which was legally frivolous and had been delivered by hand to my mailbox without postage. And then, because the moment had come, I opened my laptop and played the security camera footage on the screen I'd asked to use at the front of the room. The footage showed Judy's 3 visits to my property, including the mailbox visit, clear as day. The room was very quiet. Harold looked at the footage and then looked at Judy. Patricia looked at the footage and then looked at the table. Judy's jaw tightened. "I was conducting property inspections," she said. "From my mailbox," I said. "The notice was a legitimate HOA communication." "It was hand-delivered to a residential mailbox without postage," I said, "which is a federal postal violation. I've been advised of that by counsel. I'm not here to prosecute that tonight, but I want the community to know it's part of the documented record." Someone in the audience, I didn't see who, said quietly but distinctly, "Come on, Judy." I also laid out the trail maintenance history, the DNR's involvement, the poker run, the propane access authorization, all of it. I made the point that, while the HOA had been making my life difficult for the past several weeks, I had continued to be a cooperative neighbor, providing propane truck access during the cold snap, hosting a community event on my property, and maintaining the trail for the benefit of winter recreation in the whole area. Harold said the board would be reaching out to HOA counsel regarding the mailbox situation and the Fleming notice. Judy said she thought this was all being blown completely out of proportion. Rob Carver, the man whose house I'd helped get propane to, stood up from the back row. "He's a big man, quiet, the kind of person who doesn't speak at meetings often but commands attention when he does. Judy," he said, "Tom Baker made sure our house didn't run out of heat in -15 weather while you were trying to fine his neighbors for snow in their driveway. I think it's worth asking what this board's actual priorities are." The silence after that was one of the better silences I've experienced. The meeting wrapped up shortly after that, and in the parking lot afterward people clustered in little knots in the cold, breath pluming in the winter air, talking quietly. A lot of people came and found me specifically to say something. A couple of neighbors I hadn't spoken to much at all introduced themselves and said they'd had no idea what had been going on and that they were going to pay more attention to HOA matters going forward. The Flemings hugged me, both of them, in the parking lot in the cold. Margaret said something that made Frank laugh, and then made me laugh, and the 3 of us stood there in the freezing parking lot laughing like it was the funniest winter we'd ever had. Phil Deacon, who had driven his own truck to the meeting and who had been my partner in post-driving and fence line monitoring and general moral support through the whole saga, put a hand on my shoulder in the parking lot and said, "Nice meeting, Tom." "Not bad," I said. "The legal follow-up happened over the next few weeks, and I'll give you the condensed version because honestly the legal process is less exciting than you might hope. It involves a lot of letters and waiting and very careful language." Dave sent a formal letter to the HOA board detailing the procedural failures in the violation notices and the federal postal issue with the mailbox delivery, and requested written confirmation that all violation notices issued against my property and the Flemings' property were void. He also noted that the HOA's attempt to enforce the snowmobile ban against a state-registered trail had exposed the organization to potential liability, and suggested that a review of the HOA's decision-making process might be in order. The HOA attorney's response, which came back to Dave after about 10 days, confirmed that both violation notices were withdrawn, and that the HOA would not be issuing further notices related to the snowmobile trail or the propane access. The attorney also, in carefully lawyerly language, suggested that the HOA board revisit its notice procedures to ensure future compliance with its own governing documents. This was attorney speak for "your board member really messed this up and you should fix your process." The postal matter was referred to the postal inspector's office, which I didn't do frivolously but felt was the appropriate channel. I don't know exactly what came of that on the federal level, And I'm not claiming Judy got hauled away in handcuffs over a mailbox violation, because that's not how that usually works. But I do know that the postal inspector sent her a formal notice, because Harold told me later that Judy had been very shaken by it and had spent considerable time on the phone with a lawyer of her own. What did happen at the HOA level was a special election, called about 6 weeks after the big meeting, for the position of HOA president. It's worth noting that the HOA's own governing documents required a special election if a board member received a no-confidence petition signed by 20% of the community's homeowners. The petition went around informally, organized by Patricia from the board, who I think had been waiting for a legitimate reason to push back for some time. It collected signatures from well over the required percentage. I signed it. Phil signed it. The Flemings signed it. The Carvers signed it. Quite a few people signed it. Judy resigned from the HOA board before the special election could be held. She submitted her resignation in writing to Harold, who sent a brief community-wide email informing everyone of the change. The email was professional and gave no details. The community grapevine filled in the details, the way community grapevines do. Harold was elected as interim president. He called me the day after his election and asked if I would be willing to serve on the Trail and Recreation Committee, a committee that didn't technically exist yet but that he wanted to create. The idea was to have formal, documented agreements with property owners like me who hosted trail access, so that the community's recreational infrastructure was acknowledged and protected rather than accidentally antagonized. I told him I'd be happy to serve. Patricia took Judy's board seat and became the new HOA vice president. She and Harold started the process of actually reviewing and updating the HOA's governing documents, which turned out to be a longer project than anticipated, because the documents hadn't been seriously reviewed in about 15 years and had some significant gaps and ambiguities. Dave Kowalski agreed to do an initial review at a reasonable rate because he genuinely enjoyed this kind of work. By mid-February, the snow was still coming down and the trail was in beautiful shape. I went out most mornings before work and did a quick pass with the groomer, which takes about 45 minutes on a good machine and which I find genuinely meditative. The sound of the engine, the cold air, the pine trees, the tracks smoothing out behind me like you're ironing the land flat and clean. One morning I was out on the trail and I came around the south bend, the one where the pines get really dense and the light filters through them in these long, thin beams in the morning. And there were 4 deer standing in the middle of the trail about 50 yards ahead of me, perfectly still, watching me with those large, calm eyes they have. I stopped the machine and cut the throttle back to idle, and we looked at each other for a moment. Then they moved off into the trees, single file, their legs punching through the snow crust with each step, and I sat there on the machine in the quiet and the cold and the gorgeous winter morning, and felt a very particular kind of peace. This is what it's for, this specific moment right here. The trail, the snow, the deer, the cold air in your lungs, the quiet that only comes in deep winter when the world is insulated under a foot of snow, and everything slows down to something more honest than it is in other seasons. This is what Judy Fenwick had tried to take away with a piece of paper and a couple of bad decisions. And this is what she had not succeeded in taking, not even slightly. The no trespassing signs came down gradually, as I worked out the informal made formal agreements with neighbors whose access had been disrupted. The Garrison kids got their pond path back, covered now by a simple written license agreement that Phil helped me draft, 1 page, completely friendly, just documenting that they had permission to cross the south field, and that the permission was personal to the family and revocable if anything changed. They signed it happily. The kids didn't really care about the paperwork, but Corinne Garrison said she appreciated having something formal because it made them feel like they weren't just trespassing on goodwill. "You're not trespassing on goodwill," I told her, "but it's good to have things in writing." She laughed and said she was going to remember that. The cross-country ski track across the Southfield came back. Same deal. A simple written license. The informal parking area at the north end was formalized through a letter of agreement with the Snowmobile Club, which Greg thought was a great idea, and which he said he wished they'd done years ago because it protected both parties. By the time March came in with its promise of eventually warming up, even if it took until May for anyone to fully believe it, things at Pinecrest Hollow were genuinely different. Not perfect, because no neighborhood ever is, but different. People knew more about what was happening with their HOA. Harold sent out a monthly one-page newsletter. Nothing fancy, just a summary of what the board had discussed and any upcoming items. The Trail and Recreation Committee had its first meeting. Me and 3 other property owners whose land connected to recreational infrastructure, and we drafted a simple framework for how trail access would be handled going forward. Dave reviewed the framework for free, which I told him he didn't have to do, and he said he found the whole situation so entertaining from a property law perspective that it was basically payment enough, which made me laugh. Greg Sanner put Trail No. 7 in for a regional trail maintenance grant, which it qualified for partly on the basis of its documented access agreements and maintenance history. The grant came through in the spring, which meant professional-grade trail improvements the following fall before winter season. And Judy Fenwick. She was still in the neighborhood, still in her house on the west side of the development. I saw her occasionally at the gas station, at the post office, that kind of thing. The first couple of times it was genuinely awkward in that particular way of small community awkwardness, where you both know the full history and neither of you is exactly sure what face to make. She kept to herself at the HOA's subsequent meetings, when she attended them at all, which wasn't often. Harold told me she'd started attending a pottery class in town on Tuesday evenings, which was when the HOA meetings were held, so there was apparently a scheduling conflict. I have absolutely no comment on that. The following winter arrived early and hard, the way Vermont winters sometimes do when they're feeling ambitious. First snowfall in October, which is aggressive even by local standards. By November, we had a solid base on the trail, and the groomer was out for its first run of the season. I pulled on my helmet and my insulated suit and fired up my primary machine, the one I'd bought 3 years ago and which is, objectively, the best snowmobile I've ever owned, and I took the first run of the year down Trail number 7 from the north end to the south in the cold November morning light. The pine trees had about 2 inches of new snow on every branch, the kind of picture-perfect winter scene that people put on Christmas cards. The trail was smooth and fast. The machine was perfectly tuned. The temperature was around 8 degrees, cold enough to be bracing, cold enough to make you fully present in a way that you can't fake, cold enough to remind you that you are alive and in a specific place doing a specific thing, and it is excellent. I rode the full length of the trail, 4 miles, through my property and out to the state land connection at the south end, and then I turned around and came back at a proper pace, and it was perfect. When I got back to the north end of my property, Phil Deacon was standing at the gate with a thermos. He does this occasionally. He's not a snowmobiler himself, but he appreciates the season. "How's it ride?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee. I pulled my helmet off and stood there in the cold winter morning with the steam coming off the cup and the machine ticking as it cooled, and the trees absolutely loaded with snow in every direction. "Phil," I said, "it rides exactly like it should." He raised his own cup. We stood there in the good cold quiet for a while, not needing to say much else, because sometimes a situation resolves itself so completely that there isn't a lot left to add. The trail was open. The signs were down. The community was running better than it had in years. The HOA had competent leadership and better processes, and a trail and recreation committee that was actually doing something useful. The deer were back in the Southfield most mornings. The Garrison kids were skating on the pond, and somewhere across town, Judy Fenwick was presumably throwing pottery. Some winters end badly. Some end with a bunch of legal documents and hard feelings and people still not quite trusting each other when the snow melts. This one ended with coffee in the cold and a well-groomed trail, and the very specific satisfaction of having stood your ground in a situation where you were completely right, documented everything you needed to document. Let the legal process work the way it's supposed to work, and come out the other side with your land, your trail, and your peace of mind intact. That's not nothing, especially in Vermont in the winter when the cold is real and the stakes have a way of feeling very clear. I finished the coffee, put on my helmet, and went back for a second run.